I feel that there is less public trust in science today than there used to be. I mean, Ben, do you feel the same? And Rylan, do you feel the same?
Oh, of course. The Journal of Null Results, most of a scientist's career would get published in that journal.
They don't point to scientific evidence as the reason you should trust them. Instead, they point to the authority of science.
CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, pick your flavor of the mainstream media. Their revenue model is based on getting you to watch enough of their news anchors and programs to get you to stay for the commercials.
Here we go. Welcome on in to the Health Elevated Podcast. I am Dr. Fowers. I'm joined by Dr. David Hedges, and today we have a special guest. His name is Dr. Benjamin Carter. He's a PhD in neuroscience and currently works for geneticist research as a scientist using real-world analytics and science. The science, trust the science. It's a phrase you hear somewhat frequently in today's day and age. Somehow it's become political. Is that weird? Why did science turn political?
Oh my gosh, that is a massive, massive can of worms, right? I mean, to some degree, science has always had a little bit of a political aspect, but it's usually been mostly accidental in the pursuit of truth. But it's gotten so bad, and over the past couple of years, it's really become to the forefront of our public discourse. I mean, we've seen it now that we're recording this post-election. You've got Bobby Kennedy has now been nominated as the future Secretary of Health and Human Services to replace Dr. Rachel Levine. Of course, before that, we had COVID. We had Anthony Fauci as the spokesman who was saying trust the science the most, or at least he was, and the people around him were. Since then, that's really been an issue at the forefront of our at the forefront of our political discourse in a way that it never has in our generation or in the preceding, at least in our parents' generations and grandparents' generations. So it's a mess.
At its core, the scientific method is the pursuit of objective truth. Is that something we would all agree to?
Yes, properly applied, the scientific method should lead to an objective pursuit of truth, and it should help you try and define and pursue truth in a way that is independent of your own biases and notions.
Then the scientific method as we have it today was developed and has been developed realistically over millennia. I mean, a lot of leading, philosophers going back to the ancient Greeks really contributed to where we are today. Like this isn't something that's kind of a fly-by-night thing. Like the scientific method is pretty remarkable in its ability to pursue truth, and that's irrespective of the biases of those involved. So, I mean, maybe it's probably good for us to step back and say, what exactly is the scientific method? Dr. Carter, as our resident scientist here, I mean, how would you define, in a nutshell, what the scientific method is?
So if I had to define it, I mean, we can always go back to the simple definition we learned in elementary school, right? And go from there. So the simplest definition is that the scientific method is a process where you're trying to discover what absolute truth is. So not just what you think is true, what you perceive is true, but what's true in an external fashion, the laws of the universe, like laws of gravity. The scientific method basically starts very simply with you have made an observation of how things seem to operate in your environment. So, for example, if you take an object, everybody's familiar with Newton and the apple, right? Whether or not that's apocryphal or not, but the basic idea being that Newton watched an apple detach from a tree and it fell. And that observation, he made it, and then he used that observation to test, to create a test that he could use to define the law of gravity. So the basic idea, of course, that with the scientific method, you make an observation, you define the characteristics of that observation, and then you begin to modify each characteristic of that observation to learn more about the underlying truths that support that observation, right? Simple things like I was saying with Newton and the laws of gravity. The apple detaches and it falls to the earth. Newton used that to basically determine how quickly an object will accelerate under the force of gravity, and then was able to relate that to other things like wind resistance and that sort of a thing. Or with the a little bit more in my wheelhouse, the basic definition of what a cell is, right? The smallest unit of life. So individuals observed various
And then
samples from...
a theory is developed, and then each iteration of research expands upon that, maybe disproves aspects of it, but generates more knowledge about what the underlying truth is. So is it safe to say, with the scientific process, we never actually define what ground truth is? Realistically, we just claim to approach it closer and closer and closer with each new iteration of scientific research.
Yeah,
is that accurate?
Yeah.
I think
that
the
weren't
problem,
accurate, I wouldn't have a job.
Fair enough. But the problem is that with each new iteration of science, the necessary, computations, the measurements, the language get more and more complicated to describe what is going on. So is it, we're talking realistically about, there is this growing perhaps distrust in the science. I think, each of us has gone through scientific training of some kind or another. I feel that there is less public trust in science today than there used to be. I mean, Ben, do you feel the same? And Rylan, do you feel the same?
Oh, of course.
Okay, so whether or not our observations are true or not, we're establishing this as kind of for our discussion that we're seeing a distrust in the public, or that the public has a growing distrust in science. Could it be possible that it may not be political, but it just simply may be that the actual science is so much less approachable for a layperson, so that there's this barrier set up between what is being published in the scientific journals and what the public are able to consume? Because if you pick up a recent paper from Cell Biology, very few scientists are able to understand that, let alone very few, even fewer of the lay public would be able to make that even approachable in terms of, just the gaps between how things are written, how things are described, and how normal people are able to understand things.
Yeah, no, you're very subtly pointing towards the publication model that we have in science.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to say real quick, the reason it's become political is because the phrase trust the science is now a political phrase. But then there's a lot of truth of what you're saying with the way these publications work. And I think it kind of comes back to science now is kind of treated more of like a class than it is a scientific method. It's more of like a class of people. You know what I mean? The scientists, the
trust the scientists, not trust the science. Because in fact, the scientific method would say, don't trust the science. In fact, the scientific method would say, try to disprove it. If you don't accept it blindly, do your best to improve upon this. That's what the scientific method would say, right?
Yeah, I mean the whole scientific method is about disproving your null hypothesis, right? So it's no, you definitely got that for sure.
So does the modern phrase "trust the science"? Do you think that means trust the scientists, trust those that are in power saying things? Is that a power move? Do you think? I'd never thought about it.
Absolutely,
that way.
it is. Because
it's definitely shaping the discourse.
Going back to so COVID-19, unfortunately, is one of the prime examples of where a lot of this came to the forefront. Okay, at least from my perspective, because maybe I was unaware of the trust in science leading up to COVID-19, but whatever happened with COVID definitely brought or destroyed trust. And I think one of the reasons is because when Anthony Fauci came out to make announcements about whatever was going on, it was...
So at the time, Anthony Fauci what was his position and role?
Right.
I think that's important to state here.
What was his official title?
So he was the director of the NIAID, so the National Institutes of Allergic and Infectious Diseases. So he was primarily responsible for heading up an organization who researches allergic disease and infectious disease. So viral diseases like COVID being inside of that infectious disease definition, right? So in
theory, he should be an expert with regard to infectious disease.
Right.
Which is probably why he was tapped to be a major spokesman for something.
I mean, he was the face of science for the pandemic, at least in the United States. He was the face of science. But whenever they would talk about it, and whenever a lot of scientists start talking about it today, in order to try and get people to trust what they're saying, they don't they don't point to scientific evidence as the reason you should trust them. Instead, they point to the authority of science, which is an appeal to authority, which, as we've mentioned,
is contrary
isn't actually
to
scientific.
the scientific method.
Exactly. It's like if you're doing science, it has nothing to do with who's saying it. It should be, here's the evidence that has been presented from the scientific method, and that's all you need to.
Which
get
at its
people to
core
trust it.
is an interpretation of data. And it's a little pet
Yes.
peeve of mine when people say, "What do the data say?" Like, the data don't say anything. The data are just numbers on a screen or a page. Like, and then someone who hopefully has like knowledge of the field is interpreting those numbers in context of an observed phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're saying your theory here is that perhaps there had been some. We talk about like there's that publication model, which has its own issues, and so science isn't maybe necessarily approachable. Scientific research isn't approachable by the lay public, and then because of that, a group of individuals were able to kind of build power around like the positions of some sort of authoritarian model, build positions where they are the ones who are responsible for interpreting science for the lay public, which is an interesting position in and of itself. And then during COVID, the research and the observations were so far detached from the public that Dr. Fauci was able to, whether he did this deliberately or other people did it for him, he became the spokesperson for what was going on from this context of infectious disease. So that's kind of your theory coming into this. And so how then did that break or damage public's trust in science?
Well, it's pretty simple. When you set a leader up, they're everything that they do gets heavily scrutinized by everybody else, right? So one of the first things Anthony Fauci did really early on in the pandemic was tell the public, don't go buy face masks. They're not going to work anyways. And then shortly after that, he came back and said, "Whoops, I made a mistake. We told you not to buy face masks because we were worried you'd buy them all, and we needed them. So by the way, they actually work. We were just lying to you to manipulate your behavior." Right.
Okay, so that's a potential issue. But I want to just throw something else out here. So the scientific method itself, I don't think it's a super fallible method. I do trust that method. I think it's a good way to pursue truth. But
right.
Experiments in the scientific method, they fail all the time.
Yeah, that's the general rule, right? Everyone jokes about the journal of null results. Most of a scientist's career would get published in that journal if it actually existed.
Each of us endured graduate school. And I'll tell you right now, I don't know about your experiments. The vast majority of my experiments and hypotheses were completely wrong. And they failed all the time on a weekly basis. It was something that I had to just be comfortable with, to know that my ideas were going to be wrong. So if let's say that Dr. Fauci was acting in good faith. Let's kind of for this little and next mini section. Let's just say he was acting in good faith, doing his best. Because I know there's a political charge there. I don't want to get into that.
Fine.
But let's say that he was acting in good faith. If he was following the scientific method, it is 100% likely that he would have made a mistake in applying the scientific method with understanding how disease transmits, as he, in a position of authority, advises based on his best effort, his best hypothesis on how things could go forward, on how to resolve the problems facing the United States. And that hypothesis could have been very wrong, as he's doing his best to pursue the scientific method on a national scale. That's a possibility, correct? So, I saw this firsthand, working in a health system during the pandemic. A lot of people in positions of authority were terrified of being wrong, of making a decision and then being wrong, because the public does not have any patience for a leader making a wrong decision, especially at a time of crisis. So within that, the scientific method on a national scale was set up to fail by its very nature, because science, the method itself, leads to truth, but it leads to truth through mistakes and through error and learning from that. So if a leader were applying that and trying to move forward in the new situation, the leader would have to make mistakes along the way and learn and adapt from that. So, but then the lay public doesn't have that understanding of this is what's happened. this is what's happening and doesn't have the patience for mistakes. So is it compatible for the scientific method to be applied in that type of a global or national issue when people are not willing to give the possibility for a mistake? Or do we need to have greater understanding as a populace that we need to learn and adapt and forgive and move forward?
That's a great question, and you set that up very well. So I actually kind of agree with you. The most generous reading of history that we can give Anthony Fauci right now would be that he applied the scientific method correctly and failed, as most scientists do, until he got something right. The unfortunate thing, though, is that, again, we don't want to get too political. Unfortunately, though, his other actions suggest that wasn't the case, that he had some personal interests that he was trying to guard. But you also hit on something that's very important as well. Our educational system, for the most part, fails to teach anyone who goes through it anything about the failure rate in science. I mean, we all went through middle school, high school, elementary school, and at some point we probably did a science fair project, and that science fair project probably was wildly successful in our estimation. Whether you're doing a baking soda volcano or something like that. We've all at least seen it, right? So the public doesn't have the same experience with the failure rate in science that actual scientists do. So for them to see that failure in such a public and catastrophic manner, it's not surprising that it shook their faith in science, because they weren't prepared with the proper context and proper, really, understanding of scientific theory to know that failure was actually kind of expected and just as a basic feature of the scientific method, right?
In support of that, Ben, I would say, I went through a science undergraduate. I was a neuroscience major.
Right.
Ton of science classes. I was in no way prepared for the rate of failure in graduate school when I was actually on the hook for performing scientific research. I was in no way prepared for how high that rate was. And it took a long time to get comfortable with that. And at first it was kind of devastating. Like to really, do the research, read tons of papers, put together ideas, only to have your best effort be destroyed by a miserable piece of data. And it was just hard.
Rat number 12.
Yeah, or whatever it was. It was just like there goes that whole idea. Like, I gotta go back and do what now? Because I just did everything I could think of. Okay, and now what?
But when it comes to the public, one of the biggest issues here is not that, because I don't think people would have a problem understanding that things could go wrong. But I think the messaging was that things were known for sure. I mean, go back to the mask example, right? Oh, they're not really going to do anything. Fast forward. Oh, crap. They are going to do something. Everyone needs to wear a mask. In fact, you need to wear 2 masks, maybe even 3. And it's just the messaging the entire time was so kind of black and white. Like, we know for sure what we're talking about. And if you don't trust us, well, you should trust the science, which means the scientists, which means, in this case, one thing I don't think we're really talking about here is this was the government. There's already kind of baked in distrust of government entities, let alone government that's trying to force people to do something they don't want to do. So that already was going to have pre-baked distrust into any messaging that Dr. Fauci was going to be able to give. People are already going to be super resistant because it's the government, But anyway, it's the messaging, I think, of
so here's a question,
the lack of humility.
So what kind of, in that position, so the lack of humility is huge, but what can a leader do in that position? Because leaders are expected to be confident. And if they're not confident, no one follows them. So how does a leader then in that position move forward and be able to own their mistakes, to be able to present we think this is the best path forward, without being seen as this, totally just kind of a wishy-washy, kind of weak leader? Because that's kind of an impossible position to be in.
Yeah, it's a really terrible position, especially when no matter what you do, at least one person's grandma is going to be dead. So no matter what you do, there's going to be someone who's mad. So that's a very, the leadership aspect and the science leadership aspect of COVID is actually really fascinating to think about. So, David, I know you've read Leadership Strategy and Tactics by Jocko Willink. So, I would that the basic principle of complete ownership of everything that goes on under your leadership, right? It would have the best thing that found. So there's a couple of things going through my head. So I'm sorry, I may go a couple of different directions all at once with this, but it would have been really hard. I mean, we all know because we lived through it. It was very difficult from a political perspective to be a leader in this situation. Whether you're Anthony Fauci, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or whoever, pick any one of the individuals who had to shoulder the burden of leading us through this pandemic and all in each of its phases, right? That individual would have had to stand up in front of the entire nation and say in unequivocal terms, lay out the entire process for their approach for this pandemic, and also lay out here are the foreseen failure points of this pandemic and how bad this failure could get, and try and get people to understand all of the risks entailed with each decision. And then do that so effectively that the mainstream media doesn't chop it up into little bits and sound bites and then blast it all over the internet and confuse the whole situation even more. From that perspective alone and that particular issue, I really feel for our leaders at that time, because they had to deal with not just the disconnect between the American public and an understanding of how science worked, but also an apparatus that is not set up to communicate in a scientific fashion, even at a fifth grade level. Our mainstream media is not designed to educate, right? Our mainstream media is designed to get eyeballs on ads. That's the whole reason it exists. That's the financial model of CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Pick your flavor of the mainstream media. Their revenue model is based on getting you to watch enough of their news anchors and programs to get you to stay for the commercials, right? So that means that they have to put together a program that is designed to be entertaining to a wide range of Americans, but mostly those with the time to actually turn the darn TV on and sit there. And those are Americans who, for the most part, don't have the motivation or the background to seek out scientific knowledge to the level that it would have taken to understand all the possibilities with the pandemic. So we're talking about people like, sorry, Grandma, we're talking about people like my grandmother who sit in front of NBC all day, right? Bless her heart, she's a really intelligent lady, but she doesn't have a PhD in any of the health sciences. She doesn't have the knowledge or the technical expertise to even get on the internet and pull up Google Scholar and begin Googling basic research articles or even reviews or meta-analyses to begin to educate herself on these sorts of issues. So she is left with just whatever the mainstream media puts out, and that's going to be whatever gets you to watch the program, which for the most part is going to be information like here's the death toll today, or here's
sensationalism. Yeah,
exactly, sensationalism and all that kind of garbage. So,
well, okay.
So leading through that sort of a mess where the information is so emotionally charged and really just designed to get eyeballs on screens is really difficult, because when you sit down to read a scientific paper or have a discussion or discuss a scientific study or the results of a recent survey of all the hospitals in Wuhan, for example, that's dry, it's not that interesting, and it dickers in the details, and no one enjoys that except for the people who specialize in that, and even then they get tired of it. We did not have a social. Social is probably not the right term, but it's the best term I can think of. Our society is not designed in a way that it supports those kinds of discussions. And that really hurt us during COVID. It made it really hard for anyone in our leadership positions to actually educate us. And it made it really hard for anyone who wanted to get educated to know where to start. For example, like I cited my grandmother, even individuals like my grandma who may have wanted to understand the scientific side of what was going on with COVID, they just don't know. They don't know about Google Scholar. They don't know about PubMed. They don't know about any of that stuff. So they didn't know where to start.
Here's the thing, though. When it comes to a couple of things, I think that's a very interesting idea about like how much the media actually has to blame when it comes to people not trusting the science because of how they sensationalize science. But I don't think what you're saying would actually have solved the problem, because I know a lot of people who aren't scientists who do read research articles, but just misinterpret them to death.
That's also true. That also happens.
Like, so it's kind of weird. Like, even if you read even if you can get through the boring paper or whatever, a lot of times the fallacies of saying something's causal, for example, when it's just linked through a correlation, fall through the cracks, and people read it as like gospel truth when just because it's in a scientific paper, because I guess how science is perceived. So, and this kind of goes back to what David was saying earlier, how, even though they're scientists, try and read something on molecular cell biology, right? And if it's a super niche paper, like, I wouldn't be able to understand much of that because that's not where my expertise lies. And so I wouldn't know exactly what I'm reading, so.
Yeah. It took me several years of reading papers in a very specialized field to be able to understand the new papers coming out.
Yeah, that's very true. Each niche is so heavily developed now that's very true. Looking back at COVID, if I had tried to read all the research as it came out as fast as it could, and I was reading a lot of it, that would have been really difficult. Yeah, I don't know how it was hard even for scientists to stay on top of what was going on.
Yeah, and so because you have like kind of two things at play: the individual. Well, I don't know who to blame. I guess there's three heads to this, right? The individuals reading the information that don't understand it, right? The scientists who are writing information that's not understandable or communicating bad, like in the case of the pandemic.
Well, there's also the rate at which we were doing science. We were doing it so fast. I don't think the people who were doing those studies were synthesizing it well enough in their own heads to figure out what was going on.
Yeah. There's a ton of papers coming out.
There was kind of a freebie session in there where people could get a lot of publications that weren't necessarily high quality.
Right. As long as it's had COVID in it, there was a chance it was going to get published for a bit.
There was a sweet spot in there where you could get a paper in a very good journal without it being very good science.
Right.
Yeah. But then the third one is the news media. The one who the people who are messaging this and getting kind of the message out for more obscure stories to the public, they're packaging it in a way that can be misleading to what the actual science says. I know certain science. Go ahead.
A fourth potentially being, like the political leadership not being transparent about how they're making decisions. Or laying out what the future consequences are, like what are the checkpoints and evaluations for evaluating a course of action. So I think that'd be fair to say.